Our mission is to carry out what Paul gave us in 2 Corinthians 1, verses 3 through 5, those soul care principles about helping others. The God of all comfort who comforts us so that we in turn can comfort others.
Have you ever wondered what is wrong with gambling? I mean, in fact, today, we've even changed the word of gambling to gaming. I mean, gaming? And our casinos now are, quote, family friendly. I'm Dr. Jans, and over the last few years, we have seen a dramatic increase in the number of folks seeking help for pathological or compulsive gambling. And we ought to define that. Pathological gambling, of course, is like any other addiction. It's an addiction that takes us farther than we ever want to go, and nobody really starts off wanting to be a gambling addict. In fact, here's how oftentimes it happens. A person may even begin by, you know, those simple little scratch lotto cards. Now, we have them in most states, as you probably already realize. You start off and you get one of those cards and you are looking at it and, oh, you know, you won $5. And then the next, you go, well, I'll buy 5 more. In fact, I talked to a guy recently who said, you know, I just won $5. And, but what he didn't say is how much he lost thinking he had won $5. He actually just got back his original 5. But people move into gambling in various different ways, which we'll talk about here soon. But what I wanted you to also know is that gambling is like any other addiction. In fact, some of the most recent research is showing us that when we take CAT scans of the brain of the gambler, the brain actually looks very similar to that of like a cocaine addict. In fact, gambling for a pathological problem gambler, it's activating some of those same sites in the brain. Isn't that fascinating? You see, gambling will start off very, very slow, and before you know it, you're finding yourself at a point of desperation. In fact, the recent Diagnostic and Statistical Manual tells us this about a definition for gambling. It tells us that the person has an uncontrollable preoccupation, and it is an urge that they're compelled to do. Now, that sounds like most any other addiction. And as you know, most people don't start off saying, I'm going to be an addict. In fact, here are the common ways in which a person can get into gambling. And we'll talk too about the different personality types, and then importantly, how to help a person that's a problem gambler. When I was doing research for the book, Turning the Tables on Gambling, I got to tell you, one of the things that I found, and I actually did this, I actually got on a bus, a bingo bus. And you know, they actually have buses that go by the various retirement centers, and they pick up people and they take them off to the casinos to spend their day of bingo, gambling. And that's one of the forms of gambling, bingo. In fact, when I got on the bingo bus and doing research, one of the things that happened was I'd get in there and I was with these group of people, and they had all their very special places they would go and sit, and how they would have their little rituals and do things just a certain way. And they entered into a world, and it was their social connection. It was their place where they spent their time, not only time and money, but it ended up being their relationship. The gambling, the bingo was their relationship. It was being used to meet other needs. Now, bingo's just one, and I don't mean to be picking on bingo, but bingo is one of the many different types of ways that people can enter into a gambling problem and not even realize it. Now, I got to tell you that I, a few years ago, was guilty of falling into the prey of the subtlety of gambling. And here's what happened to me. I thought, wouldn't it be fun? Just put in Christmas stockings, some lotto tickets, just for fun, you know. And so I would do that. And then I realized that the lotto tickets in most states, the majority of people that fund those or purchase those are people that are already at the poverty level. In fact, it's usually cited that 2/3 of the people who buy the lotto tickets are people with incomes of approximately $10,000 or less. You see, truly, it's the poor that's funding many of our state lottos. And so I had to make a personal decision, on no level can I be a part of this. And looking back, not even realizing how that can happen and how we can innocently be a part of a greater gambling problem. So the lotto tickets, bingo. Oh, hey, what about things like pull tabs? I live in a state where pull tabs are, well, they're usually confined to restaurants and bars. But people don't even think, that's a form of gambling. The others that we need to mention, of course, are the sporting events. Obviously, horse racing. Obviously, betting on games. We've had many examples of individuals who have been in professional sports who also have gambling problems, and it comes out much later, and how they're betting on games. One of the things is our youth are learning earlier and earlier ages about betting, and betting is gambling, and they're betting in the schools. In fact, one of the fastest growing areas right now actually is with our youth. The problem gambling. The kids are seeing parents and others, and they're betting in school on games, and they're betting on sports events, and they're learning very early on that we live in a wagering society. Now we also find that besides the sports events, I should mention, of course, dog tracks and the horse tracks and all the various different ways that people bet on Super Bowls and the games, and it goes on, and the office pools. All of this can lead, and there's certain personalities that tend to be a little more prone towards this, but it can lead towards a very significant pathological and compulsive. Remember, compulsive is that drive. It's not satisfied until I do it. I'm compelled to do this behavior. Now, another one on our very important list here of gambling is the tribal casinos. Now, these, since 1988, have allowed, the law changed. Now, the tribal casinos they're everywhere. And many of you know this. Some of you have maybe visited one and you're kind of curious. I know that they have exceeded now over 260, and it's growing and growing and growing, the tribal casinos that bring in, honestly, billions of dollars. And that's a whole other layer of the gambling. A lot of times when we think of gambling or gaming, see, gaming is a way to sanitize that word gambling. When we think of that, we think of Las Vegas. But we need to broaden it now. It's no longer Las Vegas. It's no longer Nevada. It's everywhere. And one of the ways that it's everywhere now is through the internet. Internet gambling right now is the fastest growing area on the internet. Isn't that amazing? It is now, and it depends which particular time, but it's really running right in there with the whole sex industry on the internet as far as revenues. It is predicted that the internet gambling will far exceed the pornography revenues from the internet. Now that's frightening to think that the revenue that's coming through, there's a lot of people who, at the workplace or on their computers, are doing a lot of different gambling via the internet. Is that amazing, what's happened there? And so we're finding now more and more individuals that when they have a gambling problem, they have it in different areas because we live in a society where you have so many different opportunities to gamble, and different ways to gamble. So I can go to the card rooms, I can go to my computer at the office when nobody's looking. I can have a little internet gambling going on and most of those internet sites, many of them are, of course, run by major gambling operations and major casinos. And why are they doing that? Because it's another way of bringing people to them. And one of the things, so you can be addicted to that, you can be betting on sports events. See, we have so many multiple ways to be entangled into the web, literally, of gambling. Now, since we all know there's many different ways to fall prey to this and be involved in it, and again, nobody starts off wanting to be a gambling addict. That is not the desire, it's not the intent, but over time, as any addiction does, it's progressive, it has a predictable outcome, and gambling is a little bit trickier than many of our addictions in that it can go secret for so long. For example, a person with an alcohol or drug problem, eventually, they try to keep it secret, but eventually it's harder and harder to keep it secret. The gambling problem with the internet and the various different, a person for years can keep it secret. I recall here not long ago having a wife in my office, and she found out that her husband had for years a significant gambling problem. And she was there and she was in tears. They had several kids that were also a victim of this, and she could not believe when the financial truth of this came out. She had no idea. And he would do various forms of gambling, and for him, it began, a casual visit to the casinos, and then he got heavily involved into the internet gambling. And the day of awakening in this particular situation, which there's always a day of awakening, the day of awakening was when she actually had a creditor call the home for unpaid bills. And he had been doing this for years, keeping it secret. Now, how do you know if you have a problem? Well, obviously, you're going to be thinking about it. There's going to be that preoccupation with the whole gambling. It's like a person who can't wait to have their next drink. There's a mental preoccupation. And remember, any addiction robs us and takes us away from things that are really important to us. We become more intimate with the addiction than we do with people. It robs us of our relationship with God. And as we look at the scriptures and how gambling is talked about in the scriptures, you go, well, what's the Bible say about this? And you'll find that many times it's hard to say, well, just this verse doesn't say anything about gambling. When we look at the Bible and the scriptures and how it talks about how to handle our money, and we look at instances of gambling in the Bible, really there was lots drawn when Jesus was crucified for his clothing. Any way that you see this portrayed in the Bible, it's not in a positive way. And gambling, if we just take it from the very foundation that it's not being a good steward of our resources, just on that fundamental level alone is plenty. But you'll find in the handout, I've given you good references of how we can really go a little bit deeper and look and see what does the scriptures have to say about the handling of our money as it relates back to gambling. Now let's talk about the problem gambler and the families that are affected. First of all, rarely is it the gambler that comes in first for help. We have found that it is usually the heartache from the family members that come in for help. They've found out, they've come in first, and normally, like other addictions, gambling is one that the denial runs, of course, deep, but the gambler is usually the very last one to come in to help, and many times it's not until there's a more formal intervention or it's got to that point of desperation. So what are the different stages of the gambling and the progression? Well, one of the things that we find is a person who gets addicted to gambling usually has a big win early on in, quote, their gambling career. The big win might be, this is the winning phase. The winning phase is, you're on a roll. You didn't know that you were such a lucky person. You went into the casino, did a little blackjack, thought, I'm just going to be here for a few minutes. You started winning, and boy, things started happening. There was that euphoria and that high, and you go, wow. And then you tell yourself things like, you know what? When I win, I'm going to tithe back 10% of this, of my winnings, to the church. And so you use all these rationalizations to continue the behavior, and you're on a big win. Well, before the night's over, that big win changes. And from there, you enter into the losing phase. Now, the losing phase is a time where you get really, you're still searching for action in the losing phase. You're going to try to get back not only all the money, but you're looking for that same chemical feeling, the euphoria that you had that was so powerful when you were in that winning phase. Now, there are some folks that are more susceptible to that in the winning phase. They have, sometimes we've referenced them as the T personality, the thrill seeker, the stimulus seeker. You know, I'm kind of a stimulus seeker. I like a lot of things happening, and you know, in my life, for example, I've channeled it in positive ways. I've done skydiving, I've drove race cars, but there's that stimulus seeking. Well, see, the casinos are perfect for that. Got all the stimuli, and it can pull you in. Okay, that adds to that euphoria that you had into the high that you got when you were winning and winning. Now, when you start to lose, that losing phase, to say it's a downer is an understatement, and you are in that mode, it's a depression that you're starting to enter in. You're beginning to feel some anxiety, and you go, what happened to me? You know, God was helping me win. You start saying all these things that are not based in true reality or faith, but you're saying things like, okay, God, please help me win again. And you're doing anything to move out of this losing phase. In fact, some of the things that we fall prey to is some of the ritualistic behaviors. Now, the ritualistic behaviors are those behaviors that you have to wear something special, a certain type of clothing. You must be at a certain table to win. You've got to have certain things set out a certain way. You begin in this ritualistic, really it enters into a zone of obsessive, compulsive disorder or thinking. But you start to believe, well, if I had this way, and you go back to wearing the same clothes, or you try to recreate everything that you had in the winning phase, and you become very ritualistic. Now, remember when you're in the losing phase, you're losing money. And so what you're going to have to do here is, you're going to be draining savings accounts. You're going to be borrowing against bank cards. One of the things that we have found is you're spending quite a bit of time trying to hide your losses. So that means if you're trying to hide losses, you're being deceptive, you're lying. And again, remember, this is your own secret world. Others do not know about this yet. You're still keeping it a secret. Oh, maybe you're disappearing a little more often if you're going to a casino, or you're finding excuses or quote lies to be out of the home, or you're spending more time on the internet gambling. But this losing phase is one that the deception is growing and growing and growing, and it's not only deception to others and creating a non-reality, but it's the self-deception that really begins to grow here during the losing phase. Losing phases can last weeks or months, but you stay in the losing phase usually until you begin to have those small little periodic little points of hope. These really are the small winnings. Or the nature of gambling is there might be one little peaks up, you have a nice win, you go, oh, it's coming back to me, I'm getting back into the winning. And all the false hope that's generated there. Now, the compulsive pathological. Now, pathological means this is a disease-type process. In other words, it's taken you over, and you begin to blame others or other situations for the problem, not yourself. For example, you're going to begin to blame the casino, or something was rigged, but you're not going to be taking self-responsibility at this point. Well, however long a person's in the losing phase, the next periodic cycle that we will go through, and then see it in terms of a cycle. You got the winning, you've got your point of entry into gambling, maybe doing what seemed to be innocent behaviors. You kind of got hooked into it. Your behaviors towards gambling escalated. Maybe you've had multiple types of ways that you're gambling. You've had that winning phase. You've had the losing phase. The next predictable cycle or stage in the cycle is that of the desperation phase. Now, I keep these real simple because it just really helps us track where a person is in the gambling addiction. And remember, they're going to cycle through these, and sometimes they're going to cycle through these for years and years. We know that many times, and I've worked with people who have lost through the years millions of dollars, which seems incredible, through the gambling. Now, The desperation phase. We need to talk about that one. This is a very important phase. You're going to continue doing some of the behaviors that you were doing in the losing phase, but the desperation phase has some additional characteristics that we need to talk about, and here they are. The desperation phase is high panic combined with desperation of depression. A person will appear, and this is where it can be a little bit tricky, because they can appear very depressed and despondent. In fact, we've had individuals, they'll come in, and maybe they'll be given an antidepressant or treated for depression because the shame that they're experiencing from the addiction to gambling, they're not going to talk about the gambling. And so they're going to get the antidepressant or the treatment for depression or anxiety in order to feel better. Now, here's what's going on. So they're starting to take medication or do things that cause them to feel better. At this point, some individuals will turn to alcohol or other chemical stimulants in order to get them to feel better because they're feeling so desperate and they're feeling so despondent and depressed. And remember that depression and anxiety go hand to hand here in the desperation phase. This is the phase 2 for some that they feel that truly God has abandoned them. They do not feel at this point that anybody really loves them. They don't feel acceptable. The self-esteem of a person during the desperation phase is quite low, as you can well imagine. Their sense of self is all, if you will, muddled into this whole addiction. Now, here we are. We're in the desperation phase. You're still trying to borrow money. And here's what we see happen here at this phase. They begin to steal. The dishonesty. Recently, we had the opportunity to work with a person that had a gambling problem that also worked at a bank, for example. And this person began to embezzle from the bank because they had a gambling problem. They were in the desperation phase. They also had betting debts that were due. You can imagine the anxiety and to create and drive a person towards embezzlement. And here's what's interesting. This particular person is a good example because many times these people, they've never stolen before. In all areas of their life, they really have been an honest human being. In fact, one recent example was a high school band director who had a gambling problem. And what he did was all the fundraising that was supposed to go for a band trip for the high school kids, well, he lost it at a tribal casino. And this is when it then became public. Now, he had a gambling problem for a while, but it became public knowledge because he embezzled school money that parents and others had given when they had fundraising events and then gambled that money. So that's the desperation phase. That's the phase where the stealing and you get so desperate. And we have a little saying, desperate people do desperate things. And this is where you are on this one. Now, another trait when you're in the desperation phase is severe mood swings. In fact, it can look like a person is kind of bipolar, the manic depressive variety, because you're going to be up and down, up and down. And this is also the point where people begin to wonder about, hey, something going on with Greg. He's acting kind of weird these days. People begin to really notice. In other words, it's hard to hide it when you're in the desperation phase. The desperation phase, because you become so desperate, you will up the stakes. Your behavior becomes more random. In other words, if you're betting outrageously, you're doing outrageous things, you truly are not thinking clearly. And this is what happens in the progression of gambling. Each time we go through this cycle, the winning phase, the losing phase, the desperation phase, we tend to become, if you will, more progressed into the disorder and addiction to gambling. In other words, each time you go through that phase, it takes you farther and farther away from reality. And this is where it's important to mention that the gambling has one of the highest, the gambling addiction, the pathological gambler, has one of the highest suicide rates of any psychiatric disorder. Number one usually being the anorexic individual, the eating disorder anorexia, usually is right up there very high, but the gambling has a very high suicide rate as well. And you can see when a person's in this desperation phase, there's a lot of suicidal ideation that needs to be looked at. We know that when you're in this phase, it's generally said that 1 in 5, this is coming from the National Council on Problem Gambling, tells us that 1 in 5 will have a suicide attempt. And sometimes people are committing suicide during this phase, and we don't know really that they have a gambling problem. So now, it's very clear at this point that the person has one of the characteristics of an addiction, the inability to stop gambling. This is also clear when you're in the desperation phase. The person has been searching for action, they've gone through that losing phase, they've done all those little rituals, they've done all the things. Sometimes they believe they have to say certain things. If I say this phrase, my winnings will come back. I've even had people, unfortunately, who have used scriptures, and they've actually memorized a scripture and misapplied scripture in a casino, and even of course, prayer, and ask God to help them win. So you can see how far from reality this takes us and how distorted our reality becomes. Now, there are people and some personalities it would be important for us to talk about at this point that are more prone for this. In other words, why do people start to gamble and stay with it? What is it about these types of people? Well, let me tell you, it can happen to anybody. And so these are some things to look for. Number one, we're going to be gambling. There are people, as I mentioned, gambling for the thrill of it. They're the stimulus seeker. This is sometimes referred to as the big T personality, the thrill-seeking personality. This is the personality that is there for the thrill. They like the glamour and the lights, and they're there because that plays into their personality. Now, there are some, number two, that simply gamble for money. It is there. They're feeling that gambling is a way to bring them money. Now, some of the folks that do the lotto tickets, remember I mentioned that 2/3 of those folks usually are, from an income point of view, at a poverty level. Isn't that remarkable to think that so many of our state lotteries, people that are going in and buying those lotto tickets, are really, it's the poor that are funding the state. And we know that many times that we're told, well, that money goes towards education. Every time we've looked at this, yes, gambling industry or the states may give some money to education, but then it's usually taken out of the budget in a different way. So it's just a different way of bringing money in. Many of the different research studies that have been done in the various states to find out where does the gambling money really go, it's actually terribly alarming to see really where does it go. And is it really going to where they say it'll go? Well, even if it was, that doesn't justify that it's the poor that are funding the gambling problems and the lotto. Now, there are people, by nature of their personality, number three, they're gambling for recognition. It makes them feel important. This is a person that it's a part of their ego strength. The gambling, they want to feel, if you will, big or important, and being a cool gambler is a part of that, and they fall right into that. Now, I got to tell you that I've had the privilege of actually spending time with and getting to know what was considered one of the world's most famous gamblers. And he was a gambling cheat. His name is Tommy Thomas. And Tommy would tell me, in the time that I spent with him, he's no longer doing this, and he's speaking against the gambling industry now, and God has redirected his life, and now he's a pastor. But Tommy would tell me that he would spend hours and hours and hours studying all the rooms because he was attempting to win against people who had problem gamblers or who were problem gamblers. He would even, and this is how far this can go, he would explain to me that he had custom-made little mirror that would fit under a thumbnail. Can you believe this? This is the extent that, and this was considered the world's most famous gambler that's still alive, or cheat. And when he would shuffle cards, he would be able, and nobody'd ever see it, get enough of a glance from a little hidden mirror under a thumbnail in order to read cards. And so, but he was, so, you know, sometimes when you're playing these games, there might be a professional cheat in there as well, and they're just like the casino operators. They know the people who have the problem gambling and they're going to win, just like the casino's going to win as well. So the person that is gambling for recognition, it's really the poor, if you will, ego strength. It's a way of fostering a false sense of self-importance. Then there's those that simply gamble for control. This is number 4. They are gambling for control. They feel that they are powerful and in control. And they believe a lot of times that there's something special about them. They're the folks that feel that this is a way that they've mastered something really important in their life. They feel that they have control over the gambling, and they have control over the winning. And this type of personality has a lot of various control issues in their life. Okay, that's probably an understatement. Now, there are those, and I mentioned the bingo folks. They're gambling for the relationship. They're gambling for connections with other human beings. And some of the problem gamblers that I've worked with, they know the blackjack dealers. They know people at the casinos. It's as though those people are their friends. And they go there and may have a certain night where they meet other friends there. That's a part of their, if you will, that's their social life. But that also becomes the core of their relationships. And other relationships obviously suffer greatly. Because I've seen it where, in many cases, it's the husband, though gambling's not limited just to men. We really need to make that clear, because one of the other categories besides youth that's really growing is women and gambling. But we'll find that the husband may be there, and he has his group of gambling friends, and they meet, and have the certain days of the week that they meet, and that is, quote, his buddies. And they all have gambling problems. But it's gone on for so long that the family and others just treat it as, well, that's normal. That's just who he is. That's what he does. But really, we're in denial, and we're excusing unacceptable behavior. Wow. Well, see, there's a lot more to gambling than what you first realized. And you've noticed that I've continued to use the word gambling, not gaming, because we need to be very careful in our society, again, how the word and gambling has been made to appear normal or to appear okay by changing what we call it. That's why I'm not using the word gaming, for example. The whole industry has changed over to gaming. We have family-friendly resorts. We have all the gambling we can do at the supermarkets, and it's all in order to make it look like it's normal and okay. We need to be very clear in saying, this is not okay. It's not okay. It's not from a psychological as well as a scriptural point of view, as well as what it does to our relationships. There's just simply no way that we can make gambling an okay behavior. And the lie that many will use is, well, it's not hurting anybody. When you look at the facts, that's so far from the truth, because it's not only hurting you or the gambler and the families, but where casinos, for example, everywhere a casino or gambling goes in, we all know that within a certain mile radius, and boy, there's been some really interesting studies done on this, how the crime rate goes up everywhere that we have gambling. It changes the environment. Now, we want to mention, before we talk about why people gamble, that there are those that develop other or concurrent addictive problems. For example, particularly in the Las Vegas style gambling, and this you'll see in some of the tribal casinos that have developed as well. You'll see a lot of course, alcohol flows freely, and literally, it's free. And they know, the more a person drinks, the more they're going to gamble, the more they're going to spend money. That's a part of it. It's no accident that the alcohol is free. So you can see how alcohol and gambling usually goes together. If somebody's playing blackjack or they're playing cards, isn't there usually always alcohol there? Usually there is, isn't there? With alcohol then comes, and you've noticed this, the sexualization that occurs around gambling. For example, what do we think of? We think of Las Vegas, we think of showgirls, we think of the sexualization that occurs as well. And we need to mention that many times what we're finding is the person that entered into the gambling addiction has developed these secondary addictions, and the more that they're in that desperation phase, the more they're in that phase where they just are totally out of control, they're going to turn to these other addictions. So they're going to drink more. We've had individuals, then they really will develop a sexual addiction. They're going to turn to other things that represent temporary pleasure in order to try to feel better. And you can see how the alcohol and the sex can be a part of the picture of the pathological gambler. Let me mention, it's not always there, but we're finding the trend is there's more and more, the longer they have the gambling problem, the more and more they kind of add on these other addictions that are a part of it. And we need to mention the stealing and the deception and really becoming a person that you say, well, you know what? I've been honest my whole life, but now I have all these problems, and I'm stealing, and I'm taking money, and I'm embezzling. This can be a frightening pattern, obviously, to enter into. Well, in the book, Turning the Tables on Gambling, one of the things that I do is I outline the various different things that we need to look at, how to determine how much of a problem this gambling is. And I'm just going to share a few of those questions, because these are some that really, to answer them honestly for the gambler. And by the way, the gambler's family member and the close loved ones can answer these questions as well. But this is some very important questions to begin to take a look at, because we've got to be willing to tell ourselves the truth in order to change anything. You know, we really can't change what we can't talk about. And see, gambling is one of those things. It's secret up to a point, and you're not going to change it, or the person's not going to change it until, like any other addiction, they're willing to talk about it and say those words, I need help. Now, it seems that it takes the gambler a long time to get to that point of, I need help. The alcoholic may come to that even sooner, because the alcoholic may have, others may notice him more, or notice the alcoholic's behaviors quicker than the compulsive gambler. Gambling can go on and on. I want you to know this can go on for years. And it can be a slow progression. But there's also times where it can start up really quick. Most of the problem gamblers had a big win early on that was like a hook. Okay, here's some of the questions. And again, there's a whole series of these, but these are just a highlight of a few important ones to look at. Have you ever missed, for example, birthdays or family get-togethers or other social events so you could gamble? Have you lied about your whereabouts? You know, missing important things so you could gamble. I had a gambler who actually had missed an anniversary date with his wife. He was supposed to be home at a certain time, stopped by the casino, and this was his point of awakening. And he said, I'll be there just for a few minutes. We had a win, and he started to lose, and he wanted to win before he got home to go out on their anniversary celebration. But he got into that losing phase and didn't get out of it. And in fact, nobody knew where he was. And when it was found out what happened, again, that was his point of awakening. Now, a point of awakening is that point that says, I need help, this is out of control. And that can be your turning point as well. Here's an important question to look at. Do you think about gambling winnings and think about how to get more money to place on future gambling? There are those that, they're thinking all about where can I get money from. They're contemplating, if I bet this amount of money and do this and this and this, I'm going to have a big win. I've had people, and the question is, have you ever mortgaged your house in order to gamble? I have had several individuals who have taken second mortgages or a line of credit against their home in order to have gambling money. Now, isn't that frightening? Another important question to look at for the person that's desperate is, have you ever felt like there's no way out of this? That there's no way out? And have you, importantly, promised yourself, I'm going to quit. Look, I'm just going to go again this night, or I'm going to play this card game, or I'll be on the internet just for 15 more minutes, and that's it. I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm done. And see, that's a part of the addiction, saying, I can't do this anymore. I can't do it. And you try to stop. But remember, it's an addiction because, in essence, you can't stop. And I might add that rarely have we seen, and we know that, that through working with hundreds of individuals, but rarely have we seen anybody change on their own. In other words, the person that's a problem gambler just says, you know, one day I decided to quit. Usually we find, and there's several things they need not only to say, I need help, but they need accountability. And there are various different, in fact, programs, even inpatient programs now for the problem gambler. And it's treated much like any other addiction. But the high accountability is of key importance to the gambler. And of course, this means oftentimes being involved in the appropriate group. This means as well that you've got to come to a place in your life where you're willing, the gambler does, to say, okay, I have to concede my finances, I've got to turn this over, and I, right now in my life, I cannot be trusted with money. The gambler that applied for the next credit card, and I'll just keep this one, you know, I'm not going to use it for gambling. And you see, they're creating their own reality, and it's not too far out then that they begin to fall prey to a relapse. Gambling has very, very high relapse rates, as we know some other addictions do. It parallels so much of the sexual addiction, the gambling. The temptation gets high, the preoccupation gets high, the risky behaviors get high, and we find that it is true that the chemistry in the brain is altered, the various different chemicals in the brain. Some of the research shows us that the serotonin levels in the brain and the dopamine and those chemicals can be and are altered in the brain of the problem gambler. Now, that means we've got to really take a whole person approach to dealing with this. Yes, absolutely, we've got to have the spiritual, prayer, and have a fortress of prayer, and having people that we're willing to be honest with. And yes, we have to have prayer. And we've got to surround ourselves with that along with accountability. But then, recovery means I'm going to have to give up certain things. And for some, I've had individuals, like payday. Their check doesn't come to them anymore. And for a period of time, they don't ever see their paycheck. And they're actually given a allowance, and they have to keep a log of where every penny is spent. That's the level of accountability that we're talking about. That you've got to learn a whole new way of dealing with your finances and dealing with people. We've got to redevelop all of our relationships. It is important as well to remember that you cannot, if you've been a problem gambler, you can't return to gambling on any form. The person who buys the $1 or $5 lotto ticket at the mini market, you can't do that. You can't be involved on this on any level. It is so progressive, and the entry back to gambling, the relapse rates are so high. And so I know that a person's moved towards recovery when they understand that they cannot go to certain places, at least alone. If they're going to a meeting or a convention and it's someplace where there's gambling, they understand that they may not be able to go, or they cannot go alone. They are willing, and the person that really wants to recover, they're willing to keep that financial money spending log for however long it takes. They are willing, and they understand what it means to be dependent and to keep their focus on God and they will have with them a scripture, and many times what we'll do, we'll set up a whole 30-day program of certain scriptures that they are, and they're journaling, that they're using every day. We know that one of the things that seems to be working very well for the problem gambler is a very intense time of counseling to deal with the shame, to deal with potential relapse, how we're going to handle temptation differently. It seems to be, and this is true of many addictions, eating disorders is another one, and chemical dependency, that if we can do an intense time, and this is why a lot of times folks will need to go away from their home environment for a period of time, and they do an intense time of counseling and dealing a lot of times with some of the underlying issues, some of the personality features that set them up for gambling, and to really realign their life and their relationships, realign their relationship with God. That seems to work best. We have found, and over time, most of those working with the problem gamblers, the kind of the traditional once-a-week counseling sessions tend not to work as well if we can have an intensive phase with a person and really get in there and deal with some of those core issues. And, you know, we've got to remember that the families of the problem gambler, the heartache that the families have gone through, we've got to attend to them. And it's an understatement to say that it's going to be a long time before trust can be rebuilt. Trust is a factor that, in fact, for a spouse to say to me that, oh, you know what, he or she's not doing that anymore. I trust her now. You know, it's been a month since they started seeking help. It cannot be that quick, because the problem gambler is going to say, and you know the pattern, they're going to say, sweetheart, I'm so sorry, I did it again, and they're going to have tears, and they're going to have the, I'll never do it again. You know what, I'll give you all the money, I won't even carry money around, I won't do this again, I'm so sorry. And the despair and the apology really, truly can be sincere, but the power of that addiction is so great that it will take over again, and no amount of sincerity tends to stop those behaviors from going again. So be careful for the family members. I really believe that trust has got to be rebuilt slowly over time. To trust too soon or to cut the pathological gambler free too soon is really a setup for them, and it's a way of actually enabling their behavior to continue. The complexities of gambling are great, because when you've added on the other addictive behaviors, see, you have secondary sets of problems to deal with. And so when dealing with the problem gambler, be sure that we're covering other areas of addiction, because at this point, rarely does just gambling go alone and be the single addiction. And I have found that sometimes what we'll tend to do is we'll focus on that. That was the presenting problem that brought the person in. But what happens is we forget that they've probably begun to engage in other secondary addictive behaviors. And I've even seen it where the gambling addiction has been dealt with, and relatively successfully, but other issues weren't dealt with. And so the person continued to be a sex addict, and that addiction just continued to grow and grow. It's like trading one addiction for another. So be aware in dealing with the problem gambler that is usually a factor, at least on some level we have found. And I want to just speak, what I have found to be true is that I believe that there is hope. I do believe that people can heal from the gambling addiction. The reason why I say that, and the reason what spurred us on to begin our work in this area, was not only out of the need, but we began to see over time, with the proper interventions, the proper support, the proper prayer, the proper repentance of the heart, and the willingness for accountability. And there's so much more to it, but in a brief nutshell, that's what we're dealing with. For the person that's willing to do that, what we have found is there's about a 90-day mark that's very important to get them past. And from that 90-day mark, when you see that they've maintained and they're persistent, if they have relapsed, they're telling you about it. They're not trying to hide it. You get them past that 90-day mark, it seems to be, and you enter into the 60-day or the 6 months zone, it's also allowed some time for some body chemistry to begin to alter and change. And in some cases, the body chemistry begins to normalize. We're finding more and more, and the neuropsychology of the brain research is showing us that as the chemistry in the brain is changed, there are literally withdrawal symptoms that occur for the problem gambler. And I've seen this. I've seen the problem gambler who hasn't had his, quote, fix for a while. I've seen the traditional, I've seen him break out in a sweat. I've seen the shakiness. I've seen the panic. It looks like a drug addict going through withdrawal. And in fact, that's what it is. And the research is indicating because of the chemical changes, they literally will go through not only a psychological withdrawal, but they'll go through a physiological withdrawal. So we need to remember that the whole person approach to dealing with the problem gambler is one that is going to look at all of this. There are times where a person needs assistance. They need to be some psychological testing that needs to be looked at. There are some times we need to look at a deeper level of issues that are going on in a person's life that keeps them compelled to engage, of course, in addictive behavior overall. What is it about the person that is causing them to still engage in the addictive behavior? Now, there is hope. You get past that 6-month mark, and there seems to be, and we love to see people celebrate their 1-year sobriety birthday, and there are folks that we have seen, they can do it, and the problem gambler can change. They're just going to go through a lot of different, not only societal pressures, because the gambling is invading our society and culture even more. We're going to find there's going to be more and more ways for us to gamble, and it's going to invade our culture even more. So there's going to be plenty of opportunity for temptation and relapse. But when we keep the focus where it needs to be, and the focus has to be really on our relationships, keeping our relationships healthy. If you've put the focus on keeping the relationships healthy, working on those underlying issues, and keeping that relationship in focus with our Creator, with God, that's the foundation. And everybody who recovers from compulsive gambling, you know what they'll say? They'll say, you know what? My relationships are better than ever before, and I wouldn't trade that for anything. So it's the creating and maintaining healthy relationships. There is hope for the problem gambler.